Hello, I'm Alejandro Plastina, and I will be discussing voluntary agricultural carbon markets today. So this discussion will be based on the chapter on carbon markets, past and present, that is in Carbon Science for Carbon Markets, Emerging Opportunities in Iowa, a report edited by Lisa Schulte-Moore and Jim Jordal. And this was co-authored with Jay Arbuckle, John Crespi, and Suraj Upadhyaya. So what I want to highlight today is that voluntary agricultural carbon markets can be viable, and many private firms are establishing a presence in this environment. However, the lack of standards is hindering the market development right now. The credibility and cost of the certification process will be major drivers of the success of voluntary agricultural carbon markets. And we are aware that Iowa farmers are interested in carbon markets, but uncertain about them. So let's take a look at the evolution of carbon prices in the European Union as of recent. And those prices have really escalated and reached $92 per ton of carbon removed from the atmosphere as of recently, and that translates to about $160 per carbon offset, enough to interest many people. We've also seen an increase in the percent of global greenhouse gas emissions covered by carbon pricing initiatives around the world, and that could be carbon taxes, mandatory emission trading systems, and voluntary emission trading systems. So now we are considering that at the global scale, about 21.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions are under some kind of pricing initiative. So that brings the question of whether we can expect an explosion in agricultural carbon demand. Well, and the answer to that is maybe, but the credit cost and the credit quality really matter. In a study from 2019, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine calculated the estimated cost in dollar per ton of CO2 removed in the US and the potential rate of removal. And as you can see in the chart on the right, both forest management, afforestation, and reforestation can be achieved with at lower costs, but they also can remove, as a system management, they can remove less CO2 from the atmosphere than agricultural practices. But agricultural practices would require a much higher price to work at the large scale. Even those practices are not matched for the bioenergy with carbon sequestration system, that it's more costly than other practices, but has a larger potential to remove more carbon than agriculture and forestry. So we have to take that into account when considering carbon markets. Agriculture is not the only sector producing carbon credits or interested in producing carbon credits. Agriculture is competing with forestry and industrial sectors to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And in fact, when we looked at the statistics of the number of carbon credits issued by sector, recently forestry comes first, followed by renewable energy, and agriculture is only in the second half of the table. So before continuing, we have to define a carbon credit, what that is, right? A tradable asset, we can think like a certificate or permit that represents the right to release or emit carbon into the atmosphere. Usually, a carbon credit represents 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent amount of another greenhouse gas based on the greenhouse gas potential, global warming potential. And carbon credits are created when entities reduce their carbon emissions or remove carbon from the atmosphere with respect to a set baseline. So we have to understand that there will be a need to set a baseline and then a need to set a projection after some changes or some things have happened. Now, what are those changes in agriculture that can generate carbon credits? Well, moving from conventional tillage to reduced or no tillage, reducing stocking rates on pastures, planting cover crops, planting trees, reducing fertilizer rates, converting marginal cropland to grassland, are all activities that throughout different carbon programs can generate carbon credits. Now, if you notice, the first word in each of those lines is a verb, and that requires that something changes with respect to the baseline. So, what determines the quality of a carbon credit? Well, first thing is additionality, and that means that timing of the changes in practices really matters. Carbon removals must be additional to what would have occurred if the project had not been implemented. So carbon programs are seeking changes from your current practices, from the baseline. So let's say a farm switched to no-till several years ago, then that farm will not qualify to generate carbon credits from no-till practices. It might generate carbon credits from adding cover crops, for example, but not from the no-till practices. Although some programs are offering a one-time look-back period payment focusing on the past 2 or 5 years to incentivize participation from farmers that have been doing conservation practices for a longer period of time. The other major contributor to carbon credit quality is permanence. Most carbon programs require that practices to capture and sequester greenhouse gases be used over multiple years to secure the permanence of carbon in the soil. So if practices are discontinued for any reason, that's called a reversal in practices, then carbon programs will penalize the farmer. For example, if you signed a contract to plant cover crops every year and the weather does not allow for planting cover crops in a particular year, then there will be a penalty to the farmer for not being able to plant cover crops that particular year. Another major component or contributor to the quality of a carbon credit is the MRV system. That's the measuring, reporting, and verification system. And we need robust MRV systems to convince buyers that the implemented changes in agricultural practices at the farm level actually removed carbon from the atmosphere or avoided carbon emissions. So that's a necessary condition for the development of a strong agricultural carbon market. And you can think of this in terms of food and the organic labels. It's hard to believe that a salad is organic unless you see a trusted label on it, the USDA organic label on it, right? So something like that needs to be developed for carbon credits in order to certify a certain level of quality in these carbon crediting systems. But this market is at the very early stages of formation, and there's no clear market. It's more like a combination of different programs and a patchwork of initiatives that are facing several scientific, economic, legal, and social challenges to actually form into a market. But all these efforts that are happening now are outlining the framework for future carbon markets. And there's plenty of interest in developing these carbon markets. These are some names behind only one of the more than a dozen carbon programs out there today. So these are the funders of ESMC, just one of the programs. Now, the issue with having these different efforts evolving on a daily basis is that there are no standards to measure carbon credits. So I will present 4 different flow charts indicating how the payments, information, carbon credits, and data move through the system But just to highlight how these different companies are dealing with these four variables. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. They offer different menus to farmers, potential participants, and they are using different methods, not only to contract with farmers and sell the carbon credit, but also to quantify carbon removal or emission avoidance. So in this case, I'm showing the chart for Agoro Carbon Alliance, and Agoro works with two registries, Vera and Gold Standard. They have their activities independently verified, and they work with farmers directly, and they have their own methods to calculate what the impact of changes in practices at the farm level on carbon removal. So they offer 10-year contracts to farmers. They require at least 500 acres in the program. Payments are made on an annual basis, and the cost of participation to farmers is the cost of implementing the changes in practices only. So that's one way that farmers can work with Agoro and generate carbon credits using the methods that Agoro developed to quantify the carbon removal from the atmosphere by changes in practices. A very different system is that developed by the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, which is a spin-off of the Iowa Soybean Association. And the Outcomes Fund does not work with external registries or independent verifiers. Everything is in-house, and they work with a publicly available model to quantify carbon credits as a result of changes in practices, the Comet Farm. And they have a very different business model. They only require one-year contracts, no minimum area, and the cost of implementation is the only cost, the out-of-pocket cost for farmers. The other two projects, two programs that I will discuss are SIBO first, and then the Bayer program. And you'll see the SIBO program issues carbon credits directly to farmers, while in the other programs, carbon credits are retained, the ownership is retained by the carbon programs. SIBO offers carbon credits ownerships directly to farmers, and they follow a different model than the other two initiatives to calculate carbon credits. They follow the SALUS model. Now, and they require one-year contracts, no minimum area, but they retain 20% of the credits as to prevent or to be able to offset any carbon reversals in the future. And Bayer is another carbon program that in this case offers not only offsets, that works, not only on the offset, but also on the insets, and works directly with farmers and can accommodate apparently all kinds of changes in practices and follow different registries. But the major difference between Bayer and all other carbon programs that we studied is that Bayer pays on a per practice basis instead of per output, per ton of carbon removed. Bayer pays $3 per year per acre for doing no-till or strip-till, and $6 per year per acre for doing cover crops, and $9 if the farmer does both. So very different models, and I'm not suggesting that one is better than the other. I'm just highlighting the wide array of possibilities that farmers face today when they think about doing generating carbon credits. And we know that farmers are interested because there are responses from the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll in 2021 that indicate that between 40 and 60% of farmers agree with different aspects of being paid in order to implement more conservation practices. But still, plenty of uncertainty remains when we look at the column in the middle. At least 1/3 of the farmers in each line are uncertain about the level of agreement they have with being paid to implement more conservation practices. And that has to do with having to face a learning curve to implement cover crops, no-till, and other changes. It's costly to change practices at the farm level. So looking at the US maps for cover crops and no-till, we see that there's great potential to increase the adoption of these practices through time, but if the price is right, because again, it's costly to do that. So in summary, we have to be aware that carbon credits vary in terms of the quality, and the quality of a carbon credit will eventually translate into a price difference, right? So what determines or what affects the quality? We can say additionality, permanence, and the strong MRV system are necessary to produce high quality credits. And then the credibility and the cost of the certification process will be major drivers of the success of voluntary agricultural carbon markets. And if we can develop standards to have these programs talk to each other and have farmers understand and be able to convert their practices in one program into changes in carbon credits in another program, that would really facilitate market development down the road. But at this point, we don't have those standards, but there's plenty of interest and many carbon programs are establishing a presence. With that, I want to highlight that we have summaries of opportunities for farmers across showcasing differences across 12 carbon programs. And I invite everyone to take a look at those publications available through the Ag Decision Maker website. And thank you and have a good day.